So everybody, welcome to this panel discussion on the human costs of illicit trade, exposing demand for forced labor in the dark corners of the economy. The event is broadcast live, and I'm pleased to report participation from over 50 countries, all continents. And the recent data that we have so far is that more than 250 people registered for this event. And these people are from governments, intergovernmental organizations, academia, and private sector. A recording of this live event will be made available together with all the related materials on our website. So the event is hosted by the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, which is also known by its acronym, TRACIT, and my name is Stefano Betti. I am the Deputy Director General of TRACIT. TRACIT's mission is really to seek to mitigate the social and economic impacts of illicit trade. And we do this by seeking to mobilize businesses across sectors that are most impacted by illicit trade, but also by talking to governments and seek to shape the response to illicit trade and to strengthen law enforcement mechanisms. We accomplish this by engaging governments, working with key intergovernmental organizations in order to establish higher standards in the fight against illicit trade. And we also work to raise awareness of this problem, and in order to do so, we undertake research in key areas, and then we seek to share the various findings that we have worldwide. And today's webinar is to present our most recent report and to further explore the relationship between illicit trade and forced labor. And we're going to do this in a few minutes with the support of a panel of distinguished speakers. And the speakers are Laura Greene, and I'm going to mention them in the order of appearance. Laura Greene, Program Technical Officer from the ILO Global Business Network on Forced Labor. We have Ilias, Chatzis, Head of Human Trafficking in the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Hugh Watkins, Head of Asia Policy in the UK Intellectual Property Office. And last but not least, David Upite, Director and Assistant General Counsel in the Global Grant Protection from Procter & Gamble. But before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like to invite Dr. Ulrika Bonnier to give an overview of our new report and present its key findings. Ulrika is TRACIT's Director of Programs, and she was the principal author of this report. So Ulrika, over to you.
Thank you, Stefano. So my job today is to introduce TRACIT's report. And to do this, I'm going to explain the genesis of the report, what we found, and the recommendations that we've outlined to address the link between illicit trade and forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking. And then hopefully this will set the stage for our panel discussion. For those familiar with our work, this report is one of our cross-cutting projects, where we've been tackling illicit trade within the wider context of society, economy, security, sustainability, and human rights. So in other words, while we may spend a lot of our time briefing trade ministers, we recognize that illicit trade is not just a trade issue. This is a development issue, it's a security issue, it's a matter of financial importance, and in the context of today's webinar, it's a matter of safeguarding human rights and labor rights. So more than 90 years after the adoption of the ILO's Forced Labor Convention, 25 million people continue to be trapped in situations of forced labor. And perhaps an even bigger problem is that despite renewed global commitments to the problem through the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the annual estimates of forced labor are rising, not falling. And that trend, it doesn't look like it will change anytime soon. The ILO has reported that global progress against child labor has stalled for the first time since they began producing global estimates 2 decades ago, and that the COVID-19 crisis is likely to push millions of more children into child labor. I think even in countries where existing legal frameworks are generally considered sufficient, progress has fallen short. Regardless of the reasons for this, the first step is to start by gaining a more precise understanding of how and where human rights abuses occur. And that is what we've set out to do in this report. So looking at the root cause of forced labor, meaning that underlying commercial activity that can create demand for these types of labor abuses, we're building on the work by ILO, OECD, IOM, and UNICEF, who focus on where forced labor might occur in global supply chains. Our approach is slightly different, though, as we extend their methodology to investigate the occurrence of forced labor in the supply chains for illicit products and markets. So in other words, we're investigating the demand for forced labor in the dark corners of the economy. To do so, we're asking two questions. The first one is, if a highly regulated legal supply chain can be infiltrated with forced labor, then what can be said about unregulated, untaxed, unlicensed illicit sectors and trading markets? And then, secondly, what is the impact of illicit activity on the demand for forced labor? To find these answers, we've conducted interviews with a wide range of companies, trade associations, government agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and we've also interviewed investigators that regularly participate in raids. And I hope you agree that our findings are quite interesting, starting with the observation that forced labor and illicit economic activity that can be found anywhere from manufacturing, downstream product distribution, trademark infringing activities, and in limited cases, upstream harvesting of illicit products. So while all forms of forced labor are intrinsically illegal, it's important to point out that in this report, we exclusively deal with cases where forced labor occurs in illicit economic activity. So that would run something that would run parallel to legal supply chain operations. In our report, we focus on 8 sectors and how forced labor plays a role in them. And these sectors are counterfeiting of apparel, footwear, and luxury goods, counterfeiting of electronics, machinery, and equipment, substandard and falsified medical products, illegal mining, IUU fishing, illicit tobacco products, illegal pesticides, and illegal timber. And what we found here is that illicit trade is far from a victimless crime. Men, women, children are forced to labor in illicit sectors where they're abused by organized criminals in their pursuit of profits. And then incidents of forced labor are reported all along the illicit supply chain. So this would range from agricultural harvesting and minerals extraction upstream to counterfeit manufacturing and street corner retailing further downstream. Illicit traders, they completely disregard human rights and labor rights in their treatment of workers. In many cases, workers are being forced to risk their lives or endure severe health consequences as a result of the abuse they've been subjected to. We've also found here that while it's difficult to identify and address labor abuses and enforce human rights in illicit sectors that by definition operate underground, it's not impossible. And then while significant work is being done to address forced labor and significant work is being done to mitigate illicit trade, the nexus between these two topics, or where the two topics overlap, is a largely unexplored area where further research and data collection is needed. So, building on the findings from this report, we've outlined 3 buckets of recommendations on how to improve the work against forced labor in illicit operations. The first bucket is to encourage governments to take a holistic approach to forced labor and illicit trade. Governments must recognize and account for the interconnected nature of the two issues. Political will is key, and interagency cooperation at the national level will need to be improved. The second bucket focuses on data. And like I said earlier, it may be difficult to identify forced labor in illicit sectors, but it's not impossible. But we need more data to improve the evidence base for national and international policymaking and standard setting. We need to strengthen investigative techniques to address human rights abuses in illicit trade and dismantle those organized criminal networks behind illicit trade. And then finally, the third bucket deals with the need for a swift implementation of general measures aimed at curbing illicit trade. This report shows that if we can stop illicit trade, we can eliminate the associated demand for forced labor. So this was a short overview of what we've done in this report. It's available on our website, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have on it. The purpose of this report is to improve the understanding of where and how forced labor is abused in the operations of illicit supply networks. And we hope that this work will serve as the first step to strengthen the ability to detect, disrupt, and dismantle the illicit operations, and as a result of that, reduce the demand for forced labor. So against this backdrop, I will now pass the baton back, who will moderate today's panel discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ulrika, for this. And with that background, I would like to invite now our panelists to join me in a roundtable discussion. And we'll be exploring a number of topics and areas, and I'll ask each panelist to, in turn, to share their views. And to begin, I'd like to ask Laura Greene to share her views on the subject. As a reminder, Laura is Program Technical Officer and ILO Global Business Network on Forced Labor. Laura, question to you. As the report sets out, not all informal trade is illicit, but all illicit trade is informal, right? So could you tell us how the ILO, your organization, sees the issue of forced labor in the informal economy and the role of engaging the private sector in eradicating forced labor? Over to you.
Great, thank you, Stefano, and thank you for having me today, and welcome to everybody that's listening in. I'm going to just give you an answer in three parts. I think firstly to tell you a bit more about what we understand to be the root causes of forced labor and how this, of course, feeds into the overall problem. Secondly, focusing a bit more on the informal economy, and then finally on the role of business and how we can tap into that potential to address this issue. As Ulrika mentioned, there are at the moment 25 million people in forced labor. 21 million of those are in the private economy. These figures are from 2016. We're awaiting new figures early next year as well. And a report that was released by the Alliance 8.7 quite recently, it focused on looking at forced labor and child labor and global supply chains. And I think what this report managed to quite clearly highlight is the fact that the significant issues, they remain in the lower tiers of the supply chain and domestic economies, and also in the informal economy. And this really is then where we should be focusing our efforts. But it's a large challenge, and it means that we need to be sort of driving national conversations and looking for national level change to get at this issue where it is most prevalent. Some of the root causes that we see for forced labor at the ILO is firstly is poverty. People in desperate situations are willing to accept any type of job. I think particularly in the current situation, in the COVID-19 pandemic, this has only been worsened in many cases. Secondly, weak governance. So looking at weak rule of law and corruption, and this of course would be also directly linked to illicit trade and to where we would see prevalence of forced labor in this case. Weak social dialogue, where in cases where workers' employers are not able to freely associate, where workers are not able to sort of raise their needs and to have these addressed. Lack of awareness of labor and human rights. We need to focus on informing and educating workers and employers on an issue such as forced labor. Forced labor is often described as something that's hiding in plain sight. And because of the nature of forced labor, the fact that it takes a combination of factors to result in the finding of forced labor, that this increases the complexity, of course. Humanitarian crises, where we see income shocks, displacement. This obviously, again, another root cause of forced labor. And discrimination, factors such as race, gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, shapes how people are treated ultimately. And I think increasingly at the moment we could add climate change and environmental degradation to that list as well. At the moment, we see increasing displacement of people, and this increasing, of course, the vulnerability of people to forced labor. And the root cause that I want to focus a bit more on today is the informal economy and the lack of access to social protection. So ultimately, of course, forced labor is also very much shaped at the individual level. We see certain risk factors, namely gender. We know that women and girls, they're more likely to work, for example, in domestic work, which is where we see a high prevalence. And again, also this is something that is a strong feature of the informal economy. We also know that children are more vulnerable. There are 4.3 million children in situations of forced labor. And later this month, we'll be releasing a brief that looks at forced labor of children. That was a bit of a mouthful, but that the brief will basically give an overview of this concept and what it is and how we define it. We also see, for example, migrant workers being at greater risk as well of making up to 1 in 4 of the victims of forced labor. So I think firstly, we also need to recognize that in the informal economy, many people make their livelihoods there. I mean, this is an important part of how people exist and sustain themselves. It's also not a uniform concept. It looks quite different in different economies. And yet we continue to see that much of the global labor force finds themselves in the informal economy, and similarly that many enterprises, particularly micro and small enterprises, make up this informal economy. And yet people who participate in the informal economy, they fall outside of social safety nets. It's not only unregulated, but it creates a high risk environment for abuse because of the nature of the fact that it's unregulated. But when crises hit, again, the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, workers are not supported. They may find themselves in deepening situations of poverty, and the risk of trafficking and forced labor ultimately increases. So the ILO solution to this, it focuses primarily on formalization. We have a recommendation that sets out this transition and how it should take place. But we also need to recognize it has to be tailored to specific circumstances, to different countries, and to the workers and the economic units in different national contexts. So it's a complex but also long-term process, and requires many different interventions. And I think ultimately for on the part of the workforce, we're really there looking to ensure that they have access to decent work, and to reduce informality. This helps to ultimately ensure that there's greater access to social protection. But in the meantime, we also need solutions. If this is a long-term process, we need to be able to prevent forced labor in the informal economy more immediately. And some of the provisions that the recommendation makes is to address or to promote freedom of association and collective bargaining, ensuring that there's basic social security guarantees that form part of the social protection floors that everyone is able to access regardless of their participation in the formal economy or in the informal economy, and also access to skills and training to help to reduce the vulnerability. So I think that the economic and social vulnerability, it's a key driver of forced labor, and social protection is at the heart of mitigating this ultimately. And I think here now, having sort of outlaid an insurmountable challenge and the difficulties in reaching the informal economy, but also at the same time noting that we can't wait for formalization as much as we need to begin on that road. I think companies and their representative organizations, they really have a role to play. And this is something that from the Global Business Network on Forced Labor that we've taken a particular focus, for example, on engaging small and medium-sized enterprises, equipping them with the knowledge and information to prevent forced labor and to practice fair recruitment, and also focusing on national level institutions such as employee and business membership organizations, because they can, while they maybe deal with the formal economy, they can of course reach the informal economy too. So as part of encouraging the formalization, being able to demonstrate the value that this would have for those that participate in the informal economy, and to reach them with the knowledge, the awareness that's needed in order to successfully prevent risks of forced labor. So within the network, we really keep this front and center of how we approach the issue, primarily obviously focusing on root causes and addressing those, and engaging companies in that process, for example, through advocating for better laws, policies, and enforcement. And then thirdly, really looking at equipping businesses of all sizes and sectors to address forced labor risks. So I hope that answers your question and gives you a bit of an overview of how we see the issue, and linking the root causes to, of course, the informal economy and the role of companies.
Well, thanks, Laura. And you already injected a number of issues, many issues into this debate, and mentioned several heterogeneous drivers leading to forced labor. And also, I think very importantly, I think mentioning ILO's long-term work towards reducing informality in the sector. And thanks also for sharing some of the specific projects that ILO is currently undertaking in a very pragmatic manner to encourage this drive towards formalization. And I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, maybe a little bit a daring question, but what should we expect, if we're allowed to know, in terms of the latest figures on forced labor that the ILO will be publishing next year?
Thanks, Stefano. I think, as Ulrika mentioned, we've obviously had the figures on child labor that have been released, and sadly that showed obviously a decline in progress. And what we should highlight about that is that those measurements actually took place before the pandemic. So it's likely to have even worsened based on those numbers. So in the case of forced labor, much of the measurements been taking place over the last 2 years, when of course we have found ourselves in this situation. And much of the pandemic, as I've mentioned, is really sort of exacerbating the root causes of forced labor. So I'm afraid that we don't hold out much hope in terms of the numbers. We really are expecting this to have the issue to have worsened. Hopefully, obviously, we need good data to be able to act. And I think that this data will be able to give us renewed impetus on the issue and an increased focus. But yes, I think that the results, we should see them in the first quarter of next year. It's certainly not looking good, and we need to collaboratively and collectively come together again around this issue, particularly with the Sustainable Development Goal target looming really just around the corner.
Thanks again for this, not very encouraging, but of course, this is the reality also. We are in this pandemic, and we'll be certainly checking the data with great interest as soon as ILO will release this data. And without further ado, I would like now to thanks for your intervention, Laura, and I would like to turn to Ilias Chatzis. Ilias, as the head of human trafficking at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, I think there's nobody better placed than you to tell us what is UNODC doing to address human trafficking for forced labor.
Thank you, Stefano. It's great to be with you today. And also congratulations for the report. I think it comes to plug in a big knowledge gap that we have on how serious crimes happen in illicit supply networks, and hopefully to help us form some response to this aspect of the crimes. Now, Laura talked about forced labor. As you mentioned, we'll talk about trafficking in persons. It's another crime. It's a serious crime. It's part of the Organized Crime Convention. And it brings heavy sentences to the traffickers when discovered, and it also has a big impact on the victims of the crime because they are entitled to certain assistance and protection measures when they are identified. So, what do we do in this area? First of all, our first work is policy and data analysis and data collection, and that's why your report is quite interesting. Talking about trafficking in persons for forced labor. This is one of the types of human trafficking that has been increasing in our reports. Right now, it accounts for almost 40% of all cases found globally. It has increased significantly over the last couple of years, and it keeps increasing. In some regions of the world, the picture is very different because it's actually the majority of cases. And this is Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. And also a global report shows that victims are trafficked in almost every industry, including textile, agriculture, construction, sea fishing, and mining. And some of these industries also operate in remote areas where workers can be isolated, where labor inspectors and law enforcement do not have easy access. So in these situations, working environments are harsh, they're hostile, they're dangerous, living conditions are inhumane, they're controlled by the traffickers. So all the elements that you need to have for a serious crime like trafficking can happen in these situations. For example, we have workers on fishing boats operating in distant waters, which are particularly at risk. Fishing vessels can remain at sea for long periods of time, and people may not see the shore for years sometimes. And we have a significant number of cases in this one. Actually, we have also found that trafficking for forced labor in the fishing industry is a particular type of trafficking that actually has a very large number of victims. For each single case, I think we have hundreds of victims exploited in that type of trafficking. Now, the majority of victims for trafficking for forced labor are men, but children also are an increasingly important element of the number of children victims is increasing over the years, and right now it's 1/3 of all victims reported for trafficking for forced labor. Imagine 1 in 3 victims globally for forced labor is a child. For example, our office in Burkina Faso identified a significant share of children working in gold mining sites that they have been trafficked there. In another case reported by Côte d'Ivoire, authorities identified more than 30 children working on a single cocoa plantation site. Now, out of these 30 children, 1/3 of children were identified as victims of human trafficking. In South Asia, children as young as 12 years of age are trafficked for forced labor in brick kilns, in the garment industry, or in agriculture. And of course, child trafficking cases have also been reported in South American plantations. Now, despite this prevalence of the crime that these data show, unfortunately, our research shows that there are low level of investigations, there are low level of prosecutions, and there are low level of convictions of traffickers globally. And this is a persistent factor that we see in report after report. We have more people brought to justice and more victims brought to safety over the years, but still it remains a very small number compared to the size of the crime. And one can only imagine what the complexities would be to prevent and investigate trafficking in unregulated and unlicensed illicit businesses. And I think that's why your report is quite interesting, because it shows that in these businesses, it can also be a big problem. Now, what do we do with this data? First of all, we help countries develop a regulatory framework. 178 countries are part of the Human Trafficking Protocol, which means basically it's a universal instrument. Almost all of the countries are part of it. Most of them also have laws criminalizing it. But the implementation of this law is the one that is lacking. Many countries have perfect laws on paper, but which are not implemented. So we help them a lot refine this legislation, but also develop frameworks for the implementation of the laws, like strategies, action plan. And we have a number of them that we have worked around the different regions. Now, one of the particular areas that we're working in is actually public procurement. And this is a very important aspect because globally, public procurement accounts for about 50% on average, 50% of a country's GDP. And the United Nations is one that actually needs to lead the way in this. And we're taking measures now to develop a new framework to address potential cases of trafficking in persons in the United Nations supply chain. And there's a big process where UNODC is leading together with 30 other agencies, including, of course, ILO and all the other partners in this work. And we hope that within 2022, we'll have developed a set of conditions and criteria for the UN procurement network to be able to prevent and also sanction and take any other measure necessary in case some trafficking cases are found in the UN supply chain. And of course, we work a lot with countries to implement the legislation that they have in place. So we have a lot of training programs around the world. And despite COVID in 2021, we work with more than 85 countries in very different and challenging, difficult and challenging conditions. And most of these programs are also targeting trafficking for forced labor. Just two examples, in Colombia, for example, let me just say that one of the challenges that we see is that labor inspectors do not talk to criminal justice officials. And I think we see our role quite importantly as a bridge between the two, where we bring labor inspectors into the anti-trafficking organizations that every country has. And this is a quite important element because they usually were used to run in parallel. Now, in Colombia, for example, we set up a national network of labor inspectors on human trafficking. And in Brazil, we helped them create a special mobile inspection group that actually has saved hundreds of victims in farms, in sugarcane plantations, in cattle ranches, in factories, and in construction sites. Now, one last thing that I would like to mention is that in all this work that we do, and I think in all the efforts that all of us are making against this crime in the illicit and the illicit sector of the economies, is also the cooperation with the NGO community and the NGO sectors. And these are very close, they're on the ground, they have very good access to data and to actual information, and they're an invaluable source of information for us. And we recently published a compendium of good practices for the cooperation between the private sector, the civil society, and state authorities on how to address trafficking in persons for forced labor, which is an integral part of this work. Now, in closing, I think that there's a lot of things that each pillar of this structure needs to do. States needs to continue having regulatory framework and be able to implement it. The private sector needs to have the capacity to monitor, to hold accountable, and to also take the measures that are necessary to make sure that their supply chains are clean, and also to see how these two can also work with the third group, which is the civil society, in making all these things happen. Now, if countries, the truth is that if countries are better able to detect, to disrupt, and to dismantle illicit trade, so I'm very hopeful that this would also lead to demand reduction for trafficking for forced labor. So I would like to leave it here. Over to you, Stefano. Thank you.
Ilias, thanks to you very much. I think that in just 5 minutes, you managed to present the various challenges and the potential for improvement in a very clear and condensed manner. Yes, the challenges are there, and I was in a way happy, if I can be happy, to see that what you said is in part reflected in the report that we have released, which is a comfort to us also to know that an organization such as UNODC, which is the leader in terms of data collection and policy analysis on this, is reaching the same conclusion. Low level of investigations, especially prosecutions and convictions. Something that I think is overlooked, and I'm happy you brought up, is the fact that there is a clear lack of interaction in many parts of the world between labor inspectors and criminal justice officials in this area. And something that is new to me, and I found particularly, maybe was not new to others, but to me it was the initiatives that that the UN is taking in terms of public procurement, and it's addressing potential incidents along the UN supply chain. And I was wondering that maybe if the UN comes up with interesting outcomes and interesting standards, that can inspire also maybe potential individual governments to set up similar protocols or similar standards when it comes to addressing national government-related supply chains for public contracts, for example. And it was also good to know that you shared with the audience the information about the recently released Companion of Good Practices on public-private cooperation, and we'll certainly also look at it. And since TRACIT has just developed a signed memorandum of understanding with your organization, with UNODC, we hope we'll find a way also to ensure that maybe this companion can be disseminated through our platform. So I think there is a lot of work that we could also do together. So thank you very much for this. And we don't have too much time. I'm going now to pass the microphone over to Hugh Watkins, who, as I said before, who is head of Asia Policy and the UK Intellectual Property Office. And Hugh, the question we would like to ask you is, you have many years experience in law enforcement. In your current role, are there business and trade implications with illicit trade apart from the risks to individuals? Over to you. You should unmute your mic. Thanks.
It's always the middle-aged man who struggles with the technology. Thank you very much, Stefano, and congratulate you and the team on this report. I think the realization that this is a global problem is something that sometimes gets lost. So we need this to be looked at and viewed as a global challenge rather than try and focus it down. If I just sort of set the scene, I spent 32 years as a police officer in the UK, and in the latter part of my career, I was a lead for slavery and child exploitation. And it was very difficult to get the message across in terms of criminal labor, that people were being exploited for drug trafficking, drug maneuvering, organized theft, sexual exploitation. But when we move then into the illicit market, where the product itself may not be illegal, it may be counterfeit, it may be illicit, but it's a lot more challenging and difficult for people to get their heads around this impact. And not only that it happens in their neighborhood, the end result is seen in their neighborhood. Very often the start of this chain, this supply chain, has started many, many thousands of miles away and may pass through many hands, a good number of whom are exploited. So coming back to your question about business and trade, the UK has implemented strong anti-slavery legislation. I'm very interested to hear Ilias with the context of supply chain integrity. Businesses in the UK have to make an anti-slavery statement if they're over a certain size. However, again, we have the small, the medium, micro enterprises who fall under that. The UK has also made slavery and exploitation core business for law enforcement agencies. So you have the National Crime Agency taking this very seriously and leading on slavery and associated matters. Whenever there's media coverage of human exploitation, the public reacts strongly. There's intolerance of such conduct. Sadly, that doesn't stick, doesn't seem to stick. It doesn't seem to last. This fades away into the background and is replaced by something else. In terms of businesses, when bad businesses flourish, it's at the cost of good businesses. How on earth can a good business, a small startup, compete with somebody who's not paying the minimum wage, who's not paying tax, who's not investing in the R&D or investing in staff that a good business should do? So what we need to do is look at bringing these two aspects together. We have this exploitation. We need to get the public to understand what it is. But we also understand that we are trying, and this is, the UK is not on its own in this. Governments and countries across the world are promoting their own small MSMEs, medium, small, micro enterprises. These bad businesses are bad news for everyone. So I'm very conscious of time. And unless you have any questions on that, Stefano, I'll leave it there, but I wholeheartedly support your recommendations.
Very powerful and concise, Hugh. Thank you very much. And I think from what you say, really what emerges very clearly is the global dimension of the problem and the need to sensitize people in our countries, meaning maybe for those living in Western Europe or like in the UK, about the facts that the behavior of governments in other parts of the world, in remote areas, have a direct impact on themselves. So it's something that has to be taken into account in terms of impact to their own life and to the way they live and the way they consume, etc. It was also interesting to see that the UK government has made significant efforts in this area, and unlike many other countries, and I think its experience with this obligation for businesses to produce regular anti-slavery statements is an important experience. It's something that many governments are seeking to replicate, but the UK is also the country that can say to them to what extent this is really working in a way, or where the lessons learned are out of this.
And just one final thing from Stefano. Alongside this is in the UK, we have a powerful profit confiscation, criminal asset recovery scheme, where if we are able to identify those making millions from exploitation, then financial investigators will go after that, and that money will be recycled into making the people safe who've been the victims.
Perfect. And thanks for sharing this with us as well. Very, very interesting information, linking it to financial investigations, actually. So thanks you for this. And now let's move to our last speakers. Let's move to the private sector, right? And we're joined here by, as I said before, David Upite, Director and Assistant General Counsel in Global Brand Protection, Procter & Gamble, who will tell us a little bit about how the legitimate business sector is dealing with human rights abuses and what they are doing when observing abuses in illicit supply chains as part of their brand protection work. So I have a few questions for you, and I will start with the first one, which is, does P&G have a process in place to manage reports of human rights violations?
Well, thank you very much. Again, congratulations, and thank you for the invitation to participate in something so critical. Just by introduction, P&G, we're a multinational, fast-moving consumer goods company. We've got about 65 brands across fabric and home care, healthcare, beauty, grooming, baby and feminine care, and family care. We sell our products over 180 countries and territories, so we span a lot of the globe. The short answer is yes, we do have such a process in place. Respecting human rights is fundamental in how we manage our business at P&G. Addressing human rights is not optional or a nice to have, but rather a critical business deliverable. We support the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, and we expect our business partners to operate in the same manner. We see it as our responsibility to engage with suppliers if human rights issues occur, assess the problem, and then use our resources and expertise to come to a better solution or business practice. P&G is committed to reviewing all allegations of wrongdoing with trained teams who ensure impartial and fact-based investigations. Violations may be reported anonymously, of course, unless otherwise prohibited by law. And we don't tolerate any retaliations for concerns raised in good faith.
Well, thanks for this. And as a follow-up question, do you encourage reporting of a human right violation? Do you actively encourage that? And if so, do you have a mechanism in place to enable this?
Yeah, we definitely take every report of a potential human rights violation very seriously. This is true regardless of how we receive the report. We go further and encourage anyone who's aware of a potential human rights concern to share the information with us to enable us to investigate. And this really goes across our employees, business partners, and their employees, NGOs, stakeholders, whoever, to help enable confidential reporting. We've established a P&G worldwide business conduct helpline. This helpline is staffed by an independent company who's available 24/7, and callers can report anonymously. Excellent. And last question, what is P&G's due diligence process for responsible sourcing? Well, we hold ourselves and our partners to a very high standard. We've created responsible sourcing expectations for our external business partners. These explain the global standards that we expect to be followed in any business activities conducted on behalf of P&G. With that said, we can't identify all supply chain risks. So we review and map our largest and most critical supply chains to understand the potential negative human rights impacts to our company's activities or business relationships. We do this through a number of our industry standard parameters, including assessments of high-risk commodities or services, high-risk countries, or external expert intelligence. We've been talking a topic that's kind of near and dear to me is brand protection and our anti-counterfeiting efforts. There, what we do is we provide our investigators training on how to spot issues or potential issues of forced labor during the agency's investigations or when they're participating as part of a counterfeit raid. As I'm sure many folks know, these signs are not always obvious. So we ask our agencies to look for these signs, and when they do find them, to report that to the authorities. We track this as well, and we find that if they do this, they can bring the issues to the authorities who may not be as sensitized to this. I would also point out that these activities are part of the agreements that we have with the agencies, and we actually make it as part of the agency's KPIs or key performance indicators. It's our hope that by formalizing these expectations, we get better participation by everyone involved. Well, many thanks, David, also for this very pragmatic overview of what your company is doing, and it's actually good to have this information. And good to see that a company such as yours, with so many ramifications and so many operations worldwide, is so determined to address human rights violations. And you mentioned as a critical business deliverable, which is what I think you mentioned at the beginning, which I think it's a strong and very important statement, right? In terms, I was particularly interested in hearing you when you were talking about the system that you have set up for the confidential reporting. I think this is interesting, and it appears that it's really not just about paying lip service to it. It's really about ensuring that this works. Because if I understood correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said that you set up a helpline which is staffed by employees from an independent company. So it comes from an outside, right? That's right. And this way, everything's very objective, and certainly they have the expertise to explore that. So you're absolutely right. And to conclude also,
interesting to hear about your training program to investigators on how to spot potential incidents on forced labor, and them also acting as an interface between the private sector and the public authorities that are investigating. So thanks very much also for this perspective. It was very important for us to have a representative of a private sector company also in this webinar. And so I think that this leads to the end of this short webinar. It would have been interesting to continue. I very much hope we have quite an amount of participants connected online now, and I hope they all found it informative and that it gave them enough reasons to go to our website, to TRACIT website, and to download the full text of the report. Before we wrap up, however, I'd like to try and summarize very briefly some of the highlights. So from Laura, we learned a little bit on the root causes of forced labor, how it will reach the informal economy and focus on formalization that is being placed by ILO, while continuing to prevent issues such as forced labor while formalization occurs, how companies and representatives of business organizations can help. From Ilias, we learned how the need for more data on case of labor exploitation, both illicit and illicit industries, the importance of working closer with the private sector to tackle human trafficking. And from Hugh, we learned the experience of the UK, what the UK has done in terms of implementing strong anti-slavery legislation. And we're also pleased that that it clearly supported our recommendation, as it's kindly offered to share our report in the UK and overseas. And I also like to emphasize this point that partners need to be in this game for the long haul. So it's long-term exercise. And to remember that while there are no quick wins, every person saved from exploitation is a win for all. And finally, from David, we learned that corporations like P&G are encouraging the reporting of potential human rights violations, what he just said, and I emphasized later on. The P&G is auditing suppliers to help mitigate the risk of the companies unwittingly supporting human rights violations. And also for their brand protection efforts, we learned that they are providing training to investigators. Another point that emerged and that I emphasized in my reactions. And finally, if I had to just pick 3 takeaways from our report, I would say 3. First one, among the worst crimes associated with illicit trade is the demand that it causes for forced and child labor. Secondly, incidents of forced labor are reported all along the supply chain, something that we saw also in the introductory remarks from Ulrika. And crucially, while significant work is being done to mitigate illicit trade on the one hand and forced labor on the other hand, it very much looks like that these sort of work streams are taking place in silos. So the nexus between the two topics is a largely unexplored area where further attention, research and data collection is certainly needed. So to the extent possible, and here I'm addressing our speakers, but also all the participants that took the time to connect to us, to this webinar. To the extent possible, please help us disseminate this message within your constituencies, okay? And whatever your field of activity is, whether this leads to further academic research or to sensitizing the law enforcement community towards the need to focus investigations on these matters, or spur governments to initiate policy initiatives to better understand the nature and the extent of the problem. I think we can conclude here, and I really wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. As I said in the opening, the recording of this webinar and all associated material, including the full text of the report, will be made available immediately, basically, on our website, including the press release for this event. And if you have any questions or any suggestions on the work we do on forced labor or generally on illicit trade, please, we'll be happy to answer. Reach out to us. If you have questions, if you want to learn more about TRACIT, and if you want to contribute to our work, or if you have proposals for collaboration with us, it will be a pleasure for us to be in contact with you. And with that, I wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you very much again, everybody.